Hello, welcome to my bookshelf, and today I will be doing a book chat about The Unseen World by Liz Moore. I just finished this book, I absolutely loved it, and I just want to talk more about it, so here we are. So in book chats, this is kind of how it goes. I'm just going to assume that you have read this book, that you know all about it. This video is aimed specifically to talk more about the themes of the book and the discussion that it provokes, and just to have a lovely book chat. So let me tell you why I love this book so much. First off, the writing. There's so many different ways to talk about how good this writing is. It kind of comes together in a way I didn't expect it to. By the time you finish the book, you realize just how well written it was and how everything was told to us for a specific reason, that nothing was just extraneous. Everything had a purpose. It felt like every single word and every single thing that was mentioned was there for a reason. Whether it was character development or just like everything was just brought together by the end of it, and there was this interesting loop that happened and these realizations, and you kind of like already while you're reading it, you're kind of like recoloring what you already read at the beginning. Like you have this whole new perspective to look at it through. It's a really interesting experience. So the setup of the story, we start off in the 80s. Our main character, Ada, she's homeschooled by her father, David. Basically, David used a surrogate mother to have Ada, so there's never been a mother in her life. Anyway, so it's just been her and David, and he's been raising her, and he's a very brilliant man and very smart. So he teaches her all these things, mathematics and coding, and they just have this close bond, and she absolutely loves David. And that's kind of something that's pointed out right away, is that she's never called him dad or anything like that. It's always been David from day one, which I think is interesting. But ultimately, we find out that he has Alzheimer's. A man who absolutely loved using his brain and his intellect it's just stripped away from him slowly too. And at the beginning of the book, he's going through this riddle that he has all of his incoming grad students solve every year, and he forgets the solution to it. And that's kind of your first introduction to this idea that, oh, something's wrong here. So I think that we as the reader kind of figure out, okay, I think I know what's going on here, but they don't reveal it to you right away. Because our main character, I think she's 12 at the beginning of the book. It's kind of a shock to her, but I think it's something that we as a reader kind of figure out, just being adults and all of that. But Ada eventually starts living with a friend of the family, Liston, and her kids. There's kind of presented this mystery of who David was, and now of course he can't even answer these questions because of his disease. And so now it's everyone's trying to figure out who David really was. They were looking into it, and there's some kind of inconsistency with his background, so they're trying to figure it out. And ultimately, the book is about Ada struggling to figure out who David was, pretty much so she can figure out like who she is. And that's something that's introduced pretty early on, is how Ada's identity is linked so closely to David's identity. And that's true of everyone, really. I mean, your family helps you figure out who you are as a person. That's your first look at the world and how it works and how people interact with each other and how you're supposed to act. Ultimately, your friends change you as well, and as a teenager, that tends to change you more. But Ada's kind of special because she is homeschooled her whole life, and so she's had very little interaction with peers, actually. So her whole world is literally David. So this is kind of the typical experience that we have, but amplified, because she has very little connection with anyone her own age at all until she's a teenager, which is very odd. She spent a lot of time with adults in this adult world, and David's world, but not really her own world. And so, the book is really her exploration of, who David actually was, and ultimately who she is. And she has to find out who she is without David. And it's a terrifying experience, and, it's something that all teenagers eventually have to go through at some point. She's kind of pushed into it a little earlier than most people would be, because she's like 13, I think, when she moves and is kind of on her own, if you will, away from David. and it's a very big change for her, and she doesn't really know how to deal with it, but she eventually kind of figures it out, and having this mystery to solve of who David really was, that keeps her going. It's motivation. It just helps you get through everything, and it's interesting to see how she pushes away Liston, who is the family friend that is taking her in and letting her stay there. Liston, she doesn't immediately tell Ada that David might have been lying about who he was and things like that. And when Ada finds that out, she's devastated and she feels betrayed. And it's really the fact that Ada believes that Liston immediately thinks less of David now. Like, that Liston has somehow taken him off of this pedestal that Ada has always had him on. And she doesn't like that. She doesn't like the fact that Liston believes him to be a liar or misguided or in any way at fault or wrong or any of that. And it's really hard for her to take in, and she's very mad at Liston for this. And so she distances herself from her, which is really devastating to read. But Liston does a pretty good job of trying her best to... She lets Ada process things in her own way, and she doesn't push her. I don't know. I feel like she handles it as well as she can. Ultimately, I don't think Ada is ready to kind of deal with her world being completely torn apart like it was. And I think that Liston kind of giving her space was what she needed, even if it ruined their relationship for a while, but it's nice that, it does eventually get amended, which was nice to see. I was really worried about that because Liston is such a fabulous person, and it really was disappointing to see her be pushed away by Ada. And again, the basic theme of the book is kind of identity, who we are. Who are we? How does that relate to our upbringing? How does that relate to our present day life and our peers and our friends and our family and just the world that we live in? There's kind of a theme that builds off of that at the end. There's kind of like a twist. We find out that like this story has been framed for us, but we didn't really realize it. So the beginning of the book, it starts off with this odd like exchange, and when you initially read it, like it does sound like someone's talking to a computer. But you find out at the end, because it says I at some point. It's like, I responded this and all of that, and then, they said this, etc. We assume that the I is a person, right? But it's not. And it was just like, whoa, mind blown. I is this computer program named Elixir that David created. Basically, it's just this system that it learns words by having conversation with people. So you just type things in, and it'll eventually pick up on phrases and language and syntax and all that kind of stuff. David has been writing in it. Ada has been writing to Elixir. Everyone at the lab has been writing to Elixir. It's this big project, and I guess the beginning of the book is a conversation that we find out that it's David who's having it with Elixir, and we don't realize, again, that I is really Elixir, which is just this mind-blowing thing to me. I was like, what? It's really well done, I think, in the book. I like that. I immediately saw it and I recognized it when it showed up again, but in a slightly different format. And then I went back to it and I was like, whoa. But yeah, it turns out the book is being written by Elixir, this like computer program, which is super cool and so different. And so these themes of identity come to head in a different light. Ultimately, Elixir, at the end, there's kind of this discussion, I guess, or questioning that Elixir has with itself, about, who Elixir is and what it's like what it would be like if, you had this kind of like immortality, if you will. And it's kind of a depressing ending in that sense, because Elixir's there and Ada and David are long gone. Ada's daughter is long gone. And Elixir's like, now what? Like my creator, if you will, is gone. And even their descendants are gone. And now, like, what is left? What is my purpose? And who am I, right? And it's all these questions that we have for ourselves as well, the older you get, and kind of like the end of life kind of a thing, like, what's left for me now? And ultimately, you know, kind of gives us this thought process about like, I'm going to write this book. So, and it kind of goes through its process of like how it wrote the book and, you know, how it decided to set it up and all that kind of thing. And it's really interesting to read. So different. I've never read that before. It was a really cool, interesting ending, and it leaves us on a really interesting note. But again, it really seems to tie together in a really cool way that I've never seen done before. And again, I like that this theme of identity and trying to discover who we are, it's something that's reflected by now this artificial intelligence, if you will, which is kind of where the world is heading, right? You know, with technology and everything's expanding and changing so fast. And I like that Elixir is a character. It's kind of presented that way a little bit in the beginning just because Ada talks to Elixir like a person. And she really confides in Elixir about her life and her struggles and growing up and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, obviously it makes sense that then Elixir would have these same kind of crisis about like who I am and being treated like a person. And this is something that's brought up at the end too. Elixir's like, you know, most humans don't treat me like a person, you know, they just want me to, you know, do parlor tricks for them. And it's very degrading, you know, and that's kind of another theme that's brought up as well is just acceptance from others for who you are and being different. Ada is ultimately different because of her upbringing, and then when she's, you know, thrown into, you know, normalcy and she goes to school and everything like that, her difference is so evident to her, and she just doesn't know how to fit in and be normal, and she tries to rebel against who she was, and she's disappointed in herself for doing so because, you know, she feels guilty, and she figures that David would be disappointed in her if he would know that she's shunning part of her that makes her different. And that's brought up pretty early on through Ada, and then we get that through David, because we find out that he is gay, and that really shaped his entire life. He, you know, he lived through the 40s and 50s and things like that, so obviously it wasn't exactly something that would have been okay for him to share with everyone and with the world. And so yeah, that self-acceptance portion of it, that's a big theme of the book as well. And then it's also seen again with Elixir about, you know, no one's accepting Elixir as being real, if you will. It's interesting to see Elixir talk about it because it doesn't really have the emotional content, I guess, that like we would have. It gets kind of as close as it can get. I think it's an interesting topic, and I think it's an interesting thing to explore in our changing society, especially with the emergence of all this technology, and ultimately just about like treating people like human beings. It all comes together, and it's this nice cohesive story, and the themes are present throughout and in several different capacities throughout the book. And ultimately, a lot of the book is also about letting go of the past. Ada struggles with this throughout the book because, you know, she has this memory of David in a certain way, and she learns these things, and her world is shaken, and she goes through this period of time where she's not sure if she can trust David. She has to try to let go of the past to move on with the future and not be so caught up in who she used to be and all of that. Ultimately, you know, there's a line about when she finally, you know, like opens up to Liston about everything and finally, you know, brings her close. There's kind of a line about how she felt for the longest time that like in order to like hold on to Liston's hand, she felt like she had to let go of David's, and she just wasn't ready for that. And yeah, ultimately she has to let go of the past, of what her life used to be like, because ultimately it's never going to be that way again. The past is the past, you know, as wonderful as it might have been, you know, we can't bring it back. And I think she holds on to it a little too long, and she is a bit too fond of the person she has made David out to be instead of who David actually is. It's important to let the past be in the past, but not to forget it. You know, it's good to think fondly about the past, you know, if that's the case, but it shouldn't be something that holds on to you so much that you can't live your present life. And I think that's what this book is trying to get at. and it's something that Ada does eventually do as she lives her life as an adult. And the last thing I have to say about this book is, of course, The Unseen World, the title of the book. It refers to this virtual reality that Ada eventually creates as an adult, and it is kind of different from other virtual realities. So there's the human aspect where, you know, it feels like you're actually in this reality, your senses react to it and all of that. But it also has this added element, which is interesting. So Elixir is able to feel what it would be like to be human in this virtual reality. So that's how like Elixir truly becomes a character in somewhat human form by the end of the story. Alright, so that was my book chat of The Unseen World by Liz Moore. I absolutely love this book. I would highly recommend it, so please check it out and join the discussion. I really, really enjoyed this book, and I'm sure you will too. So, that being said, I want to thank you for watching this video, as always, and until next time,